We're now live, so people can start coming in. Start the screen.
And I do have a clock on my computer, both of my computers. So
yeah, I was paying attention to time, and I saw you pop up the 10 minutes, and it's like, okay, this moderator knows what she's doing.
Well, I had just come off from being a host, so. Okie dokie. Oh, we've got some people here. Very nice. I wonder if I can see that. If I can. Oh. Hello, everybody. I'm Danyda Feldman. I'm a storyteller, and I'm delighted to be at virtual MileHiCon 52. I wish that we were all in person and that I could tell stories in person, but this is the next best thing. So I'm delighted to be here and to tell you some stories. I'm going to tell a mix of stories because this is a webinar, so I don't know exactly who all is in the audience. So I'm going to tell some kiddie stories and a spooky story, which I have just fallen head over heels in love with. It's a book from my fellow storyteller. Her name is Janice Del Negro, and she's based in Illinois, and the book's showing up backwards. It's called Lucy Dove. Anyway, it's a great book. It's a great story, and it's very spooky. So, and as with any spooky story, the key is that at the end of the story, the spooky, the scary just goes away. So, a long time ago, when wishes were horses and beggars could ride, there lived in a castle by the sea a laird, a rich laird. He was a pretty good laird as lairds go, but he had one fault, and that was that he was very superstitious. He believed that black cats were good luck and that poor little black cats were bad luck. Excuse me. Oh, he just told me in my ear right here that black cats are bad luck. I don't believe that myself. And that four-leaf clovers were good luck. And so he kept a soothsayer on staff, a fortune teller, who one day said to him that if he could get a pair of trousers sewn by the light of the full moon in the graveyard of St. Andrew's Church, that they would bring him luck forevermore. Well, everybody knew stories about St. Andrew's Church. Nobody went there because there were tales that something horrible lived amongst the graves. And they were brave but foolish young men who heard these stories, and they went to find out for themselves. And whether they found out or whether they didn't, no one ever knew because they were never heard from again. But the laird didn't care. He wanted his lucky trousers. And so he demanded that a proclamation be sent out throughout the land saying that there would be a sackful of gold to whoever could bring him these lucky trousers sewn by the light of the full moon in St. Andrew's churchyard. Well, the fortune has her way, and she always will. Lucy Dove heard about the laird's request, and it turned out she was a seamstress, and she could use a sackful of gold. She had a vision in her eyes, inside her mind, of having a place of her own, a little cottage by the seashore, and a place in the sand of her own. And so she decided that she was going to take on this quest. Now, she was a very good seamstress. She was very clever with her needle, and she could use that sackful of gold because she had just been let go by the staff at the laird's castle, as it so happened, because even though she was still clever with her needle, her hands had slowed down just a little bit with age. So she decided that she was making this plan, that she was going to do this, and she knew something about graveyards and curses and goblins and ghouls and foolish lairds who wanted lucky trousers. And she figured that if anybody was going to do it, it might as well be her, and she might as well benefit. So she pulled together the scraps out of her scrap bag, and she got together her pins and needles and her thread and her shears, and she got everything ready. And on Saturday, which was the first night of the full moon, she went down with all of her supplies down to the churchyard. Now, she had taken all of those scraps and she had pinned and she had basted them into trousers to fit the laird. And she went down between sunset and the light of the moon into the churchyard, and she found the best spot to sit, which was on an old grave next to an old tomb. Now the light of the moon started up full above her, and she began to stitch those trousers. And she worked along, and her stitches were neat and even. And she thought about her little cottage by the shore and how grand it was going to be. And she was just about thinking that the stories were just stories, when all of a sudden the air was filled with a smell. And it was a smell of dank and decay, of dark places and rot and death. And then, out of nowhere, the tomb beside her cracked open with a mighty crack, and a head started to lift itself up out of the tomb. And there was a voice that came out of the sunken mouth and the sunken eyes of a gruesome, misshapen head. And it says, "So long have I laid by myself, without anything to eat or drink, no blood, no meat, and all I am now is blood and bone, bone and marrow, bone and blood." And Lucy carried on sewing, and all of her stitches were neat and even. And she glanced up and she said, "Oh, there all that while. I'm sorry, didn't see you." And the creature lifted a twisted neck out of the tomb, and it said, "You see this twisted neck of mine, old woman? I have long been without blood and meat, and all I am now is bone and marrow, marrow and bone, bone and marrow." And the little old woman, Lucy Dove, she sat there and carried on stitching, and she said, "Oh, all they've been telling all the stories about." And the creature lifted a misshapen, twisted arm out of the tomb and said, "Stories about me? Have they told of how fierce I am and how dangerous and how evil I am, and that unfortunate men have come into my domain and they have never seen the light of day again?" And Lucy, she thought, "Oh, well, sure, they're usually stories that they tell to little children to help them go to sleep at night." Stories for little children. And he lifted another arm out of that tomb. And this tomb, instead of being gnarled and twisted at the end of it, had 5 sharp, razor-like claws. And they reached for Lucy Dove, but they could not catch her because she was just out of his reach. You know, you hear stories and it's all fine. And she took a little breath and her throat was feeling a little bit dry, but she carried on stitching and her stitches were still neat and even, but a little bit larger than they had been before. "Do you see this leg of mine, old woman?" And as it spoke, it brought an old, gnarled, twisted twisted leg out of the tomb. For too long I've been without meat and blood, and all it is bone and marrow, marrow and bone, bone and marrow. Well, I can see it and I can smell it, and I'd rather do without either, said Lucy Dove. And she took the last stitch of those lucky trousers. She tied a knot in her thread and she snipped it off with her shears, and then she leapt up and grasped those lucky trousers to her, and she began to run. Well, the bogle inside the tomb was so surprised that she got a pretty good head start, and success had given her youth as she took off down the graveyard. And then the bogle cried out, "Stop, old woman, stop!" But Lucy did not look back. She carried on running as that bogle hauled his other leg out of that tomb and started racing after her. And Lucy clutched those lucky trousers to her and she ran. She did not stop running. She did not look back until she got all the way to the Laird's castle, with its big old strong gate, a strong wooden gate, a sturdy gate, a locked gate. And she pounded on that gate. She didn't have any breath left for calling out, and that bogle was coming down the hill towards her. And just as he got close, the gate opened just a crack. She slipped inside, the gate shut with a slam, and the bogle let out a howl and slashed the air with his claws and took a chunk out of the stone above the gate with his claws and left a mark for all to see. So Lucy, she gave those trews to the Laird, who tried them on and declared that they were the right thing. And so after that word, I don't know if those trousers really were lucky, or if the bogle was ever satisfied, because no one ever saw him after that, from that day to this. And the only evidence that he was ever there at all are 5 claw-shaped marks in the stone above the door of the Laird's castle, the same as the marks that Lucy marked out in the shore in front of her own little cottage on her own piece of shore, and she lived contented for all the rest of her days. And that is the story of Lucy Dove by my friend Janice Del Negro. And as I said at the beginning, let all the scary be washed away. So now I'm going to tell a story that I love, which is called Big Pumpkin. It's by Erica Silverman. Once there was a witch, and one day the witch decided that she wanted to make pumpkin. And so she climbed to the top of the hill outside her house. She dug a little hole, and in it she planted a pumpkin seed. And she went and she got manure and she got water, and every day she climbed the hill and she got that plant watered, and it began to grow. And soon a little flower appeared, and soon a pumpkin appeared at the end of the vine. And the pumpkin grew and grew and grew and grew until it started to turn yellow, and then it turned orange, and it was ready. And it was the beginning of the day of Halloween. So the witch climbed the hill to get that pumpkin so that she could make pumpkin pie. And she wrapped her arms around the stem of the pumpkin, and she pulled, and she tugged, and she yanked, And she pulled hard, and then she pulled harder, but the pumpkin wouldn't budge. And the witch said, along came a ghost. And the ghost looked and said, big pumpkin. And she said, yes, it's ripe and it's mine and it's stuck on the vine and Halloween is hours away and I want to make pumpkin pie, but I can't get it to budge. And the ghost said, well, I am bigger and stronger than you. I will get it off the vine. And the witch said, hump. But then she thought about pumpkin. Stepped aside. And the ghost took a hold of the stem of the pumpkin, and the ghost pulled and tugged and yanked and pulled harder, but the pumpkin would not budge. And both the ghost and the witch said, along came a vampire. And the vampire came up to them and said, big pumpkin. And the witch said, yes, it's mine and it's ripe on the vine and I want to make pumpkin pie, but it's stuck and I can't get it off. And the vampire said, well, I am bigger and stronger than both of you and I will take the pumpkin off the vine. And the witch said, hump. And the ghost said, hump. But then they thought about pumpkin pie and they stepped aside. And the vampire took a hold of that pumpkin stem and he pulled and he pulled and he tugged and he pulled harder, but the pumpkin was stuck tight. And the vampire said, drat. And the vampire looked at the pumpkin. And then they heard another voice, and the voice said, big pumpkin. And they looked, and there was a mummy. And they looked at each other, and they looked at her, and the witch said, yes, it's mine, and it's ripe, and it's stuck on the vine, and I want to make pumpkin pie, but we can't get it off. And the mummy said, well, I am bigger and stronger than you. I will get it off the vine. And the witch said, hump. And the vampire said, hump. And the ghost said, hump. But then they thought about, and they stepped aside. And the mummy came forward and she grabbed a hold of the stem of the pumpkin and she pulled, oh, and she pulled some more, oh, and she tugged, oh, but the pumpkin wouldn't budge. And the mummy said, Dora. And the witch said, Dora. And the vampire said, Dora, ah, ah. And the ghost said, Dora. And then along came a little bat. And the bat came over, flying, as bats do. And the bat said, oh, big pumpkin. And the witch and the vampire and the ghost and the mummy, they all looked at each other and they burst out laughing. And the bat said, I may not be as big or as strong as any of you, but I have an idea. So the witch took a hold of the pumpkin stem. The ghost took a hold of the witch. The vampire took a hold of the ghost. Don't ask me how, it's a story. And the mummy took a hold of the vampire, of the mummy, excuse me. And the bat took a hold of the mummy. And they all pulled. And they pulled. Woo! And they pulled. Ah! And they pulled. And the pumpkin came off the vine. And it bounced. And then it rolled all the way down the hill. And it landed at the witch's front door. So they all went into the witch's house. And the witch made pumpkin. and they all enjoyed the pumpkin pie. And as the sun was just starting to think about maybe it was almost time to be coming up, each of them said that they needed to leave, and they thanked her for a very nice party. And they were all gone, and the witch was all alone by herself in her house. And she said, "Great." And in the morning, she woke up early and she climbed up the hill and she dug a little hole and she planted a pumpkin seed. And that is Big Pumpkin by Erica Silverman. My next story is called The Biggest Pumpkin Ever. You think the big pumpkin was big? This is an even bigger pumpkin. Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. The Biggest Pumpkin Ever by Stephen Knoll. Once upon a time, there were two mice who both fell in love with the same pumpkin. Now, Clayton was a house mouse, and he came out into the garden one morning early, and he saw on the pumpkin vine that there was a little baby pumpkin just starting to grow. And he said, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, if I can take care of this pumpkin and I can make it grow really big, then I will win the pumpkin contest in the town on Halloween." Well, that night, there was another mouse, a field mouse called Desmond, who also saw the pumpkin in the garden. And he said, "Oh boy, if I take care of this pumpkin and I water it and I make sure that it grows really big, I can carve it into the most awesome jack-o'-lantern that has ever been seen anywhere, anytime." And so each of them decided what they were going to do. During the day, Clayton came out and he made a mix of manure and water, and he fertilized the pumpkin and he watered it. And in the evening, Desmond came along with a mix of fertilizer with manure and water, and he also took care of the pumpkin. And this went on for days and days and days. And the pumpkin began to grow and grow and grow. And it was getting into a very nice place, and it was becoming a very, very pretty pumpkin. Well, Clayton brought his mum out to see the pumpkin, and she looked at it and she said, "It's very nice. But you know, the real secret, sugar water." So Clayton listened and he was ready to do what his mum said. Now that evening, Desmond brought his uncle out to see the pumpkin. And his uncle said, "This is a great pumpkin. I think this is going to grow the way you want it to. But I have a secret for you. And the secret is sugar water." So the next day, Clayton came out with a little bowl of sugar water, and he cut a slit in the vine and he put that slit with a straw into the sugar water. And that evening, Desmond came along. He also had a bowl of sugar water. He also had a straw, and he opened up the vine in the pumpkin and he put that vine into the sugar water. And the pumpkin continued to grow and grow and grow. And it was getting bigger and bigger and more beautiful. Well, the next night, it was coming close to Halloween, but it was getting very cold. And the weatherman on the television said that it was likely to be a cold snap and it could get very frosty, and watch out for your vegetables. So Clayton got alarmed and he went out in the evening with his blanket, and he realized that the pumpkin was so big it was going to need more than just his blanket. So he went back inside and he got all the blankets he could get his hands on. Meanwhile, Desmond had heard the same news, and Desmond came out with all the blankets he could find. And Clayton was on one side of the pumpkin, and as he was covering the pumpkin with the blankets, he was humming a little hum to himself as he covered up the pumpkin to protect it. And he could suddenly hear somebody else humming a little hum and putting blankets on the pumpkin. And so he went all the way round the other side of the pumpkin, and there he found Desmond putting blankets on the pumpkin as well as he was. And he said, "You've been taking care of the pumpkin." And Desmond said, "You've been taking care of the pumpkin." And of course, the only thing they could do was laugh, because it was tremendously funny. No wonder the pumpkin had been doing so well. So each of them told the other what their intentions for the pumpkin were. And since they were very agreeable, what they decided was a good compromise. So Clayton would get to take the pumpkin to town and enter it into the pumpkin contest. And then when that was over, they would move the pumpkin and Desmond would be able to carve it into a jack-o'-lantern. And because the pumpkin was so very big, they needed help getting the pumpkin into town. And Desmond said he had some friends who would be able to help with this very important job. So on Halloween morning, 100 field mice on motorbikes pulled the pumpkin all the way to the hill just above the town. And what they realized very quickly, and the mayor agreed, was that there was no way that the pumpkin was going to get able to go through the streets of the town. So they decided they would leave it where it was. And since there really wasn't any competition, the mayor awarded a blue ribbon to the pumpkin, which of course Clayton and Desmond decided to share. And then after the competition, Desmond and Clayton and all their friends, because it was a very big pumpkin, carved that pumpkin into the biggest jack-o'-lantern you have ever seen. They filled it with candles, and after dark, that face, that big, smiling, spooky face, glowed over the whole countryside for all to see. Thank you. So I don't know who I've got in my audience, but I'm going to dress it up a bit. Thank you, Gabriel. I appreciate Gabrielle. I beg your pardon, and thank you, Matthew. Oh, thank you. So what I meant was, I don't know if I have adults or children in the audience, but I'm getting a sense of a more grown-up vibe. So I'm going to break out my good spooky story. So I'm warning you now. So, and I love that you're children at heart. So I'm warning you now in case there were any littles who were attending, because scaring small children is not something I like to do unless I'm paid really well. So I'm going to tell you a couple of good spooky stories. And the first one, I've heard it told a couple of ways. I've heard it told as a Midwest story. Oh, they read Goosebumps books, then they'll be fine with these. And as with any spooky story, once the story is over, the spooky goes away. I have to tell myself that, otherwise I won't sleep at night, just saying. So I leave the really scary stuff to my sister-in-law because she likes all the zombie films. So the way that thank you. The way that and for people on the Twitch channel, I'm getting some nice comments from my audience. So Matthew just said that was nice. So I've heard this story as an Irish story, and that's the way that I tell it. So Tiger Ken was a young man who was the youngest son of his father. And because of this, he was terribly, terribly spoiled, and he thought that he could get away with absolutely anything. And everybody said it didn't matter what his eldest sons did, that Tig was the favorite, and he was going to inherit all the wealth when the old man passed away. Well, and Tig knew this, and he knew how great he was, and he knew how handsome he was, and he spent all of his time in the bar, in the pub, and courting all the pretty girls. and he would never settle down. And his father finally realized, when Tig was about 25, he finally realized that he was partially to blame, at least, for Tig's reckless behavior. And he said to him, son, you have got to settle down. Why don't you just pick out one of those nice girls that you've been courting all this time and settle down and marry and get a job? And Tig said, no, you'll not be telling me what to do. I would rather dance with a dead man than settle down before I'm ready. And he staggered out of the pub, and it was close to midnight, and he got to the crossroads. And as he kind of staggered through the crossroads, he heard sounds coming from the side of the road in the mist. And all of a sudden, before him, he beheld these strange little black creatures. They weren't men. They weren't fair folk. They were just dark. And they were carrying a partially decayed corpse between them. And they set it down at the crossroads and they said, oh, Tig O'Kane, you've come just in time. It's very fortunate that you found yourself here at this particular time, because it couldn't be luckier, wouldn't you say? And Tig, through a partially drunken haze, said, what? What are you talking about? The little black creature said, oh, well, we've come here to grant your wish, as it were. Now, this hall has been left, driven in unconsecrated ground for far too long. And what we've decided is we'll grant your wish, because we heard what you said to your father back in the pub. And we thought, well, if that's the way you feel, why not do it? Here you are. You need to take this poor soul and find him a place in consecrated ground before sunrise, or else. And I said, I'm not going to be doing that. You don't tell me what to do. You can't have any control over me. I'm going on my way. And he turned around and he started down the road. But all of a sudden, that corpse kind of lifted itself up and slammed itself onto Tig's back and held on with clammy hands. And Tig tried to shake him off, but there was no letting go of that creature. And the little creatures all laughed and cackled at his distress. And they said, you have by sunrise, Tig O'Kane, to get this poor soul into consecrated ground, or else suffer the consequences. And so they vanished back into the mist. And Tig was left on the dark road with this thing hanging on his back. And he said, where on earth am I going to take this thing? And what's going to happen to me if I don't? Oh, how did I get myself into this situation? I need to just learn to hold my tongue and listen to my father. I'm such a fool. Where am I to go? And all of a sudden, one of the hands of the corpse holding onto his back reached up and pointed along the road. That way. And Tig was very rattled to hear the corpse talking at all. And he carried on the road in the direction that the corpse had pointed, and he got to a church. And the church looked deserted. There was a gate, and there was a door into the chapel itself. And he thought, well, get this over with as quickly as possible. And he tried the door, but the door wouldn't budge. And the voice again said, there is a key of the door. Well, Tig reached up above the door, and sure enough, there was the key to the chapel. And he opened the door and went inside, and it was dark. And it was one of those old chapels where the bodies were buried under the floor. And he found a spade in the corner of the chapel, and he started to lift up the stones of one of the graves to drop this corpse off his back. But as he got down underneath the flagstones, there was a shouting at him and a howling coming out of that place, and he knew he couldn't put them here. And he tried another spot, and when he got down to the coffin, an old skeletal woman's hand reached out and tried to grab him around the throat. And so he put the flagstone down as quickly as he could, and he said, "We'll not be finding you a place here. Here are good, God-fearing Christian folk, and they will not be disturbed. We'll have to look elsewhere." So they left the chapel, and again the corpse pointed down the road, and Tig made his way with that corpse hanging on to the back of him, and wishing again that he had listened to his father and hadn't been such a cursed fool. He was no longer intoxicated. He was quite clear-headed, and the fog was rolling up from the sides of the road as they came to an old churchyard. And they went in, and again Tig looked for a place for the poor soul to be laid to rest, but there was none to be found, for all the places were occupied, even though the stones were breaking down, and the churchyard had not been tended for many a long year. It was getting later and colder, and dawn smells were starting to come up into the air. Tig could feel the difference as the darkness was starting to shift into what would become day. And he knew that if he didn't complete his task, something unspeakable was going to happen to him. He didn't know what, but he didn't beg to think about what it might be. He was so scared. And he carried on with the directions of the corpse on his back pointing the way until he came to a field. And the field, he could see that at some point it had been an old churchyard. How old it was, he didn't know. But there was a place where the ground had been disturbed, and a freshly dug grave was open and prepared. And when he looked down, there was a coffin down there, but the coffin was empty. And so as he turned, the corpse fell off his back down into the coffin, gave a sigh, and dust came out of the corpse's mouth, and it relaxed, and the lid closed above him. And Tig, with his bare hands, filled in that grave. And just as the sun was starting to come up, he mumbled something like a prayer. And he was free. And he ran all the way back to the pub where he had been the night before, and he collapsed on one of the benches and fell fast asleep and slept all day, all night, and into the next day. And his father at home had been worrying about him, because fathers do. And finally, when Tig turned up, covered with dust and muck, and a story like nothing the old man had ever heard, nor could hardly believe. But from that day onwards, Tig O'Kane changed his ways. He married one of the pretty tavern wenches that he used to flirt with. He settled down and found himself a good job, helping his father on his estate and learning how to follow in his footsteps. But he never, ever, ever went out again at midnight. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I've just been getting claps from my audience. My mum is listening in the other room and she's clapping for me as well, which is wonderful. Thank you very, very, very much. So I'm going to tell a fairy tale because I like them. And I love stories about women who are strong And this is another Scottish folk tale. And it's called The Woman Who Flummoxed the Fairies, which is one of my very favourite tales to tell. Once long ago in Scotland, there lived a woman who was a baker. And she baked cakes. She baked the loveliest cakes that anybody had ever tasted. And if anybody came to one of her parties, they were gone in 5 seconds flat. Now, it so happened that the fairies loved cake more than anything else. And back in those days, they loved these women's cakes more than anything else, but they couldn't even get a crumb because as soon as they were set down on the table, they were gone. And so the fairies concocted a plan. And what they decided they were going to do was they were going to bring the woman to fairyland and make her bake cakes for them for all the rest of eternity. So they came up with a plan. And they found out where she was going to be the very next evening. And she was going to be at the royal palace. And they knew this. They knew which path she was going to be taking coming home. And they laid in wait for her. So the woman was coming home after baking cakes all day. She'd been baking cakes for the royal wedding. The princess had got married. And as she was walking home, she thought about what a wonderful day it had been, that she had done the thing that she loved best in all the world because she was a true creative. And they had let her do all kinds of wonderful things, making the cakes and being very festive. And she had had such a good time. And the wedding had been so lovely. And the bride had been so beautiful. And she had had such a great experience. And they'd paid her well, which was even better. And as she was walking home, she noticed that there were an awful lot of fireflies flying around in the area at that time. And it was kind of odd because it really wasn't the season for fireflies, but it wasn't fireflies at all. It was the fairies. And they were throwing fairy dust into her eyes. And as they did this, her arms started to feel tired and heavy, and her legs started feeling tired and heavy, and her head and her eyes. And she thought, oh, I've got to sit down just for a moment because if I don't close my eyes for just a second, I'm not going to make it home. And so she sat down on a wee bannock by the side of the road. And she said, I'm just going to close my eyes on this little hill for just a few minutes, and then I'll manage my rest of my way home. And she closed her eyes. And that was that. When she opened them again, she found herself inside fairyland. Now you might think, oh, I'm in fairyland. Yay, I'm in fairyland. But if you know anything about those Celtic fairies, you wouldn't be quite so thrilled because they were mischievous. They were not very nice. And if they got you in their power, they would keep you forever. And you could never go home again because once you were enchanted, nothing else would ever be the same. Now, the woman knew this. She knew her folk tales. She knew her mythology really well. And she was frightened because she knew that if she couldn't get home, she would never see her family again. She would never see her husband or her wee bairn back at home. And she didn't want to do that. So she thought, there's got to be a way that I can deal with this. There's got to be a way to solve this problem. So she thought, I'm just going to play along. I'm going to see what they're after and see how I can bring this to my advantage. And so she made a whole big production of yawning and stretching and rubbing her eyes. And, oh my goodness, is it the fairyland I found myself? I've always wanted to come to the fairyland. I'm so excited to be here. I know your honour's brought me here for a reason. What can I do for you? And the fairy king explained to her that they wanted her to bake cakes for them for all the rest of eternity. And she said, oh, worked for. This is what I've dreamed of, that someday I would be good enough not to be on a cooking show special, but to come to fairyland and bake cakes for all of you for all the rest of time. I can't wait to get started. Where's your kitchen? Took her to their kitchen. And she said, all right, I need all the ingredients for making cake. And I apologize in advance to anybody who's gluten-free or sugar-free or vegan, because I'm going to make the cake that I like. And so would she. So she said, I'm going to need eggs and milk and sugar and flour and raisins and almonds and vanilla and chocolate. And the fairies looked at each other and they said, we haven't got any of that. And she said, you brought me here and you don't have any of the ingredients to make cake. And I said, no. And she said, well, there's only one thing to do. You're going to have to go back to my house and you're going to have to find all the ingredients. You'll find them all there because I'm a baker. That's what I do. And I have ingredients at my house. So the fairies picked themselves up and they were all so excited because they were going to get cake. And they flew on their wee little fairy wings all the way to her house. And they brought her back eggs and flour and milk and raisins and almonds and vanilla and chocolate. And she said, oh, that's grand. Thank you very much. So now what I need is a bowl to mix the batter in. And the fairies there, they brought her the bowls that they had. They were bowls. And she said, I can't make a cake in a bowl that size. I mean, just look at the eggs, look at the bowl, look at the eggs. No. And there's thousands of you here. I can't make a cake for everybody. No, if this is the best you've got, you'll have to go back to my house and bring me back my big yellow crockery bowl. You'll find it on the sideboard. So the fairies picked themselves up and they flew on their wee little wings and they were all so excited because they were going to get cake. And they flew to her house and they brought her back the big yellow crockery bowl. It was very heavy. And they brought it to her. And she said, oh, that's grand. Thank you very much. She broke in the eggs and she measured in the flour and the almonds and the vanilla and the milk and the raisins and the chocolate. And she started to put it all in there by hand, of course. And then she said, all right, I need a whisk and I need a wooden spoon to mix the batter. And the fairies looked at each other again. And she said, oh, I know, you don't have any of that. Well, you have to go to my house and get my whisk and get my wooden spoon. You know the drill. Off you go, little fairies. And the fairies picked themselves up. And they flew to her house and they brought her back the whisk and the wooden spoon. And she picked up the whisk and she began to beat the cake mixture. Beat, beat, beat. 3 times she managed, and then she stopped. Oh, just thought, what makes my cake really good? I'll tell you what makes my cake really good is my cat. Now, I know even across the screen, you're looking at me like I've lost my mind, but here is the method to the madness. See, my cat lies in the kitchen, and I know there's cat lovers amongst you. You know, the cat kind of keeps you company, and he purrs, and he soothes your nerves and your turbulent soul in the light of all the stuff that's going on. You need to bring me my cat if you really want good cake. And the fairies wanted really good cake. So they got up and they flew, oh, cake. And they went to her house and they brought back the Moggy, the cat. And they brought back the cat. It was a big cat. And he gets into the kitchen, sees his mistress, drops down on the floor, and begins to purr. And she starts beating the mixture again with the whisk. And she stops after 3 beats and she says, my dog, you've got to bring me my dog. And the fairies looked at me like I imagine all of you are looking at me right now. And she said, no, 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 no. You see, my dog lies on the kitchen floor and he sleeps and he snores. And the thing is, the real secret, do not tell Martha Stewart because she'll be after this, is that the dog snoring tells me how fast to beat the cake mixture. Now, I know you want really good cake, fairies. So you need to go and get me my dog. So the fairies, they got themselves up and they flew and they brought back the dog. It was a big dog. And they brought him into the kitchen. He sees his mistress and the cat and he lays down on the kitchen floor, starts to snore. And the woman starts beating her cake mixture again. Beat, 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 in time with the dog's snoring. And she got 4 beats, and then she stopped and she screamed out, home by himself. He's got a new tooth coming home, a poor wee bairn. Oh, you've got to bring me with my baby. I can't make cake if I don't have my baby with me. I just can't do it. I absolutely can't. No, you think I'm kidding me? No, I absolutely can't. I won't do it. I absolutely will not do it. You must bring me my baby now. And she made such a fuss that the fairies decided they better go and get the baby. So they picked themselves up and they flew. They were so excited because they were going to get cake, but they were getting a little bit worn out. But they got to the house and they got the baby and they brought him back. And he was a big baby. And they set him down. And he was vexing and crying. He had a new tooth coming in. And the woman gave him a bit of sugar to chew on, and that kept him quiet for 2 seconds. And then she gave him the wooden spoon to play with. Now, I don't know how many of you know about babies and things they can bang. And he did. And he started going like this. Bang, 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 with a wooden spoon. What you should know about those ancient fairies is they cannot stand loud noise. And this is why you never see them anymore. It's just too noisy in our world. You have to go very, very far out to find them anymore. And don't go looking for them because they're kind of cranky. And so they were covering their ears and they were yelling at the woman over the baby's cries, saying, can't you do something about the noise? And she said, I'm trying to bake a cake here. I can't bake and babysit. You'll have to get his father. So the fairies, they picked themselves up and they flew. And they went to the house and they brought back her husband, the baby's father, who was very surprised to find himself in fairyland with his wife, his cat, his dog, and his baby. And he was very surprised to see what was going on. And the woman starts beating the cake mixture again, and she leans over to her husband with the noise of the baby going on, and she says, pinch the dog. And he says, what? She says, listen to me, man. Pinch the dog. So the husband leans over to the dog and pinches him hard. Now, we don't have a dog, but I'm told that they don't like that. So the dog raised itself up and begins to howl. And the baby was crying and banging the spoon. Bang, 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 bang. And the fairies are going mad. And the woman leans over to her husband and she says, step on the cat's tail. Well, the husband figures it out by now. And he not only steps on the cat's tail, he stands on it. Now, I don't have a cat, but I've been told that they don't like that. And so the cat raised himself up and began to screech. Oh, and the dog was howling, and the baby was crying and banging the spoon. Bang, 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 bang. Well, the woman finishes beating the cake mixture, and she pours the batter into 2 large pans. And she says, all right, I'm ready to bake this. Where's your oven? And the fairies looked at her and they said, we don't have an oven big enough for pans that size. And she watched them all just go white to the very roots of their hair. And she said, well, now I could send you back to my house to get my very large stove to bake these cakes. Or here's the thought for you. What if you take me and my family home and I bake those cakes in my oven, in my kitchen, in my house. And I bring the cakes to the place where you found me tonight. And what's more, I promise, for as long as I'm able, every week I will make a cake and bring it to that same spot. And the king of the fairies is never to be outdone in a bargain. And he said, if you'll do that and keep your promise, then whatever you find in its place is yours to keep. Now, since the fairies were way too knackered to take anybody anywhere, the king of the fairies clapped his hands. The side of the hill opened wide, and the woman picked up the 2 pans of batter, and she walked out. And the husband picked up the baby under one arm and the whisk, the bowl, and the wooden spoon under the other, and he walked out, and they were followed out by the cat and the dog, and the side of the hill closed with a bang. And the fairies looked around. It was so wonderful. It was quiet. And the woman and her husband, they went home, and the woman baked the cake true to her word, and she decorated it as nice can be. And she brought it to that fairy bannock where the fairies had kidnapped her. And she set it down, and no more than blinked, and the cake was gone. And in its place was a bag filled to the brim with fairy treasure. Now, every week after that, the woman kept her promise, because if you make a promise, you must keep that promise, especially to the fairies, because they can be nasty little buggers. And she brought the cake to the same hill and set it down, and no more than blinked. And in its place was fairy treasure. So she was rich. She never had to work again if she didn't want to. But she did it because she loved it. It was her favorite thing. It was her passion and her joy. And she was, after all, like we all are in this room, artists. And because of that, she lived happily for all the rest of her days. And I wish that to each and every one of you, that you find out what it is that you love, or continue pursuing that you love, and do it with all your heart. And then you, like the woman who flummoxed those fairies, will truly live happily ever after. And I thank you for your attention this evening. I thank the beautiful and talented Jessie for being my Zoom host. And I want you to all have a fabulous rest of your con. And thank you, Matthew and Gabrielle, for being in the room. Oh, yes, make those chocolate chip cookies and send me some. Thank you very much. Thank you all very, very much. Make cookies, make art, write stories, be you.